All right, so next up I want to talk about meditation and mindfulness. And so, as you may be aware, there are many different types of meditation and mindfulness, different practices that people can engage in. Sometimes we combine these with movement work in practices like yoga. Sometimes we do them just as meditative practices where we sit still. And these practices come from many different, really deep, rich spiritual traditions. And so, unfortunately, that's not what we're focusing on in this class. While I find that extremely interesting, there's whole classes on that, a whole major in this university on that topic. If you're interested, this is something we talk more about in my positive psychology course. But here what we're really going to focus on is the physiological mechanisms by which mindfulness works to help us to cope with stress and the physiological stress response. And so here we'll be focusing on how the breath work part of mindfulness that really cuts across many different practices leads to better coping with stress. So that's what we'll be talking about here. So if you'd like to try one out for yourself, I've posted one on our weekly page. This is one of my favorite really short ones, just as something you can do throughout the day to check in with your body and do some breathing. So I encourage you to try that one out, and if you like it, to try out others. If you don't like it, I also encourage you to try out others, because there are so many different types of mindfulness and different people who make recordings, different apps, different YouTube channels, and also you can do mindfulness on your own as well. It doesn't have to be a guided meditation, although if you're neurotic like me and have a lot of thoughts spinning around in your head, you might find that really helpful. But again, what we're focusing on here is really the physiology that underlies the efficacy of mindfulness to reduce stress. And so how does that work? How does the breathing part of mindfulness impact our heart rate and our stress reactivity? And so that's what I'm going to talk about here. But in order to do that, I need to just give a little bit of background on the heart and how that works. And so first, we have in our heart, everyone has a sinoatrial node, and this is sort of our built-in pacemaker. It sets a heart rate of 105 beats per minute through sending out electrical signals in the heart that tell the other atrium and ventricles to expand and contract to pump blood throughout the heart. So if you ripped your heart out of your body, it would beat at 105 beats per minute. That's what it would do on its own if it was not attached to any other physiological systems. But of course, you realize that most of us, our resting heart rate is not 105 beats per minute. For most of us, our resting heart rate is much lower, around 60 to 80 beats per minute. And so what's accounting for that? Oh, so this is just saying, again, that the sinoatrial node propagates a signal through the heart, and that's what expands and contracts those ventricles. And so what accounts for our heart rate actually being slower than 105 beats per minute? Well, of course, it is attached to other systems in our body, right? We don't just have the sinoatrial node. Our heart is not ripped out of our body. It is in there, and it's connected to our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. So this is a schematic showing that, and you can see that there are fibers coming down from the brain and spinal cord that are connecting to the heart, and the sympathetic cardiac nerve is going to tell your heart to speed up when you're under stress, right? You're going to want to mobilize to run away from that lion if you're a zebra. And we also have the vagus nerve, which, if you remember from our last lecture, is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, and this operates to slow the heart down. And so, as we learned before, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, they have opposing influences, right? The sympathetic speeds things up, the parasympathetic system slows things down. But I said in our last lecture that, while most of us learned in biology in high school maybe that you're sort of in one state or the other, that when you're running, you're in the sympathetic, and when you're resting and digesting, you're in the parasympathetic, but it's not that simple. They're actually both active all the time, just the relative amount of activation of each can vary. But it turns out that our vagus nerve, or what acts to slow our heart rate, that part of that main piece of the parasympathetic nervous system, that's active, that becomes activated every time we breathe out. And it's suppressed or not activated every time we're breathing in. And so when we engage in breathing exercises, right, we're slowing our breath rate, and that means we're spending a longer time breathing out than we would have been if we were just breathing regularly. And so this will slow your heart rate, right, because you're spending more time with that vagus nerve activated to slow your heart rate, and so your heart rate overall will slow down when you engage in deep breathing. And I don't think it's by coincidence that many meditative breath work exercises have you breathing out for a longer time and then taking a shorter inhale and then breathing out for a really long time. And that's giving you even more time with that vagus nerve activated to slow your heart rate down. And so, importantly, also, you might have heard about heart rate variability in the literature. This is one of the hot measures for looking at stress, as well as all kinds of other physiological processes. And the vagus nerve and the fact that it's active every time we're breathing out is what contributes to heart rate variability. That's what causes us to have variability in our heart rate. And so we often think, our heartbeat, if it's 65 beats per minute, that it's beating regularly, that it's beating like a metronome, right? It's beating at a constant distance between each heartbeat, that they're beating like a drum that's in time. But it turns out that that's not the case, that our heartbeat is not regular, and that's actually a good thing. That's a healthy thing. That's heart rate variability, and we want that. And also the fact that our vagus nerve is connected, this is what accounts for the fact that our resting heart rate usually is about 60 to 80 beats per minute and not up at 105, right? The fact that our heart is connected to our parasympathetic nervous system and we are breathing, this is what's bringing that down, the fact that we are spending time with that vagal nerve activated. Whereas, again, we said before that the sympathetic nervous system has the opposite effect, where that's going to speed up the heart and also increase its contractile force, or how hard it's pumping with each beat. And again, this is a good thing when we want to run away, right? We want our heart rate to speed up. We want it to pump more blood to the periphery of our body so we can move our limbs quickly. But if we're just thinking about an upcoming assessment, then that's probably not what we want. So, vagus nerve, right? And I said this is what contributes to heart rate variability. This is what it looks like. I used to do a lot of physiological work as a graduate student, so taking people's EKGs or ECGs, right? This is the electrical signal that your heart is giving off, and you can see that while it looks fairly regular, there's actually a different distance between each beat. Each one of these peaks is representing a beat of the heart, and you can see that there's 845 milliseconds between these beats, only 745 here, then it goes back up to 812, back down. And why it's varying is because the person is breathing here. And so by looking at this, we can actually tell that they're breathing out around this beat, and then they're breathing in, and then they're breathing out, and they're breathing in. And so you can see how the distance between the heartbeats fluctuates with breathing. And so again, if you make a point to breathe slower and spend a longer time on the exhale, the distance between those is going to expand during those out breaths, and there's only so many seconds in a minute, so the more that those expand, the fewer heartbeats there are going to be in that minute, and your heart rate is going to go down. And so this is what happens when we engage in these breathing exercises. We're increasing our heart rate variability, but we're decreasing our heart rate overall. And so again, as we've said, many forms of meditation, mindfulness, as well as biofeedback, if you've heard about that before, where you try to train people to sort of recognize and control the symptoms of stress, they all involve breath work. That is our way into controlling our physiology, right? We can't really directly control what our heart is doing, but we do have, the vast majority of us, as long as we're healthy, we do have a direct control over what our lungs are doing. We can instigate a breath, right? So we can do that consciously. And with training, if you engage in meditation over time, your vagal tone can be increased. And what vagal tone means is how effective your vagus nerve is at slowing your heart rate down with each breath, right? So if I have really strong vagal tone, it's like that nerve is really tough and really strong, so every time it comes on, it really slows down the heart a lot. Whereas if I have weaker vagal tone, I still have a vagus nerve, it's still active when I'm breathing out, but it's slowing the heart rate less. It's not as strong at what it's trying to do. But with training, as I said, we can increase our vagal tone. So engaging in meditation and breath work, if you do that a lot over time, that vagus nerve gets better and better at slowing your heart rate. It basically practices what it's trying to do and becomes more effective at that. So again, yeah, your vagal tone is how effective your vagus nerve is at slowing down your heart rate. And so when you have greater vagal tone, this becomes an individual difference. With training, also people just seem to be born with individual differences in vagal tone, right? Some of us just temperamentally are more reactive to stress, have a harder time slowing our heart rate, but we can train this over time, and this leads to less stress reactivity, and in the long term, less chronic inflammation and all of the health effects that follow from that. And so early work with meditation was all confounded by the fact that they were looking at, for example, monks, so people who self-selected to live a life of meditation and peace and calm, and they're likely to be the kind of people who are able to do that well. And so certainly they showed less stress reactivity and less chronic health problems than the average person. But more recent research has been able to randomly assign people to interventions where they, for a summer, for example, engage in meditation workshops, and over time we see that their vagal tone actually increases, and so their ability to slow their heart rate in the face of a stressor gets stronger. Your body gets better and better at slowing its heart rate with each breath. And then, of course, mindfulness practices also work through a lot of the reappraisal mechanisms that we talked about, right? Many forms of mindfulness are about self-distancing or accepting negative states or seeing things in a different perspective or finding the positive. So there's also many cognitive and emotional ways that this works, but I think really pertinent to us as health psychology students is the physiological mechanism. I also put exercise in here, although we're going to talk about this a lot more in the course in relation to sleep as well as exercise and diet. But exercise is also a way to decrease stress, and some of the ways that it works overlap with what we're talking about here with the heart. It turns out that exercise is also another way that we can increase our vagal tone. As you probably know, athletes have a pretty low resting heart rate, right? They might have a resting heart rate that's even lower than 60, right? And this is because they have worked over time through training to basically have their body not need to get to such a stressed out state in order to engage in these really physiologically taxing tasks. The body's really good at recovering quickly and slowing the heart rate, and so the vagal tone has become very strong through training, and so exercise can work in a similar way as meditation in terms of increasing vagal tone over time. And so what's interesting about exercise, right, is exercise is technically a physical stressor, right? You're stressing your body out by getting on that treadmill, pushing your heart rate up. And so you're actually engaging voluntarily in a stress response in a way, right? You're activating a very similar set of physiological patterns. You're sweating, your heart is racing, you're pumping a lot of blood. But what's interesting about it is that while in the short term it is going to increase your levels of cortisol and adrenaline in order to mobilize the resources to run on that treadmill, ultimately those go back down. And because with exercise we actually are using that adrenaline and using that cortisol and engaging in a physiologically taxing task, our body is able to get back to a good level after that, right? It's expending the resources that it's mobilized, and so this helps to reduce stress in the long term. We'll also see in a later lecture that exercise can really help to just regulate the HPA axis and the cortisol system, and can play into health outcomes and stress through regulating sleep and diet as well. And so really in the short story here is that while exercise in the short term is going to increase your cortisol, you're going to have a quick peak, but your body's going to recover well from that. And so that's actually going to help teach your body how to do that, so that in the future, when you have a spike in cortisol for things other than exercise, your body's also going to be good at handling that and recovering from it. So endorphins, they also, of course, feel great. People talk about a runner's high. I have only had that a few times in my life. Mostly I just find running painful, but certainly exercise does and can release endorphins. We'll talk about these in the pain lecture a lot. This is one of the reasons that you don't always feel an injury when you're playing a sport is because of the endorphins that are blunting pain, right? And so that's really about pain, but also that makes you feel a little less stressed if you're feeling better, and that can help to reduce stress. As we said, it can also play into better sleep. We'll talk about that more. And then also, this is why I put this here is that it's related to the vagal tone, as we said, that the deep rhythmic breathing of exercise, as well as the push of cortisol up and really challenging your body to slow its heart rate down and activate that vagal nerve, really trains it over time so that you become stronger at that, and so that your resting heart rate becomes lower and lower and your body gets better at coping with physiological stress. So as I said before, I measured a lot of these things in graduate school, and part of being in a physiology lab means that you have to test yourself and your friends a lot when you're designing a study and making sure equipment works. And one of my good friends in grad school was not only someone who did yoga every day at 6 a.m. and meditated, but had been a really top swimmer in university, so a great athlete. And we would put her in these stress tasks, and we just didn't see the same kind of reaction as you do with someone like me who has much weaker vagal tone, right? So it shows much less reactivity to stress, but also a faster recovery when someone has strong vagal tone. And we could really see this in her changes in heart rate and blood pressure relative to other more neurotic grad students like myself, who don't practice mindfulness and are not top athletes. Also, exercise can help us reduce stress in the sense that it gives us a sense of mastery and control over things, right? Often we don't have much control over our job, it might feel like, or what's happening with school or our relationships, but for many of us, something we can control is engaging in a workout or feeling a little stronger than you did yesterday. Maybe you only lifted 10 pounds yesterday and now you did 15, and so that's gives you a sense of mastery and accomplishment. And as we know from what causes stress, a sense of lack of control is part of that. And so even though you might not actually change the situation, it's not problem-focused coping per se, but it's emotion-focused in the sense that you're giving yourself another outlet to find control and mastery over yourself and your environment. So exercise is also a really great way to decrease stress. And as we'll learn later, it's also healthy for a variety of other reasons. So we'll pause this one here and we'll pick back up with talking about nature.